Hi everyone, it's Kristen from Media Bretta Wanna Knits here with another sort of casual style tutorial for you. And this time we are going to be talking about how to be a great test knitter. Test knitting, if you are unfamiliar, is a service that you can provide to independent pattern designers to help them test out their patterns before they are released publicly for purchase or published in a magazine or a collection or anything like that. Test knitting is going to help them make sure that the pattern makes the thing that it is supposed to make. It's also a way for them to get samples, sort of, examples, I guess, examples of their pattern in different yarns, in different sizes, on different body shapes and sizes, so that people who might be interested in buying the pattern have more to look at than just, the designer's own photos. So a lot of people are interested in test knitting. It is an unpaid service most of the time, but you are getting a chance to get that pattern for free, the one that you're testing, and then most designers are going to give you an additional pattern from their shop free of charge as well. So while there is no monetary compensation, you are getting a little something for your trouble. And if you'd like to see test knitting be a paid job, you have to start paying more for patterns. That's just how it works. Test knitting actually, though, can often lead to other opportunities like sample knitting, which is paid, generally speaking. So test knitters, especially for popular designers, can be kind of competitive. There are a lot of people that want to test, and some of the more popular designers really are having dozens of people test a pattern, but there are still, I recently did a test knit for Jessie Mae Martinson, and she indicated that 600 people had applied. Most designers are not going to let 600 people test their pattern, because then who's going to buy it? So it can be kind of competitive. And it is a way to support your favorite independent designers. And so in that regard, presumably you want to do a good job. So I put together 5 tips that I have for you on how to be a great test knitter. So number 1, be realistic. And that goes for both the time frame and the work that is involved in the test knit. So most designers are going to establish a deadline. Most designers are somewhat flexible, but be that as it may, you should still be cognizant of your skills and whether you are going to reasonably be able to expect to finish your project on time. So you love the pattern, you really want to test it, the deadline is in 3 weeks and you are homeschooling 5 kids, maybe you're not going to be able to finish it on time or even close to on time. So as much as you want to test knit it, it's really important to be realistic about what you can do in that time frame. And the same goes for what's involved. If the pattern is 2-color brioche, syncopated brioche with steeking, and you've never done any of those things before, that doesn't mean that you can't do it. It's probably going to take you longer than someone who has more experience with those techniques. And so again, that deadline that is set may not be reasonable for you. And so it's really important to be realistic about your skills and the time frame for the test, so you don't waste your own time and you're not wasting the pattern designer's time either. So hand in hand with that is number 2, work to deadline. Stuff comes up and pattern designers are well aware of that. Pattern designers themselves are quite often moms that are trying, especially in the pandemic, moms that are trying to work from home, do this pattern design job, and are also, taking care of kids. They might have a day job. We understand that things come up and sometimes you just can't make that deadline that you agreed to. And we generally understand that. But going back to number one, we can help avoid that problem if you're realistic about what you can do in the time frame and whether you can reasonably expect to finish whatever it is. And also by, as soon as you know that you're not going to meet the deadline, you let the designer know. It's important for a number of reasons, and I'm not gonna get into it too much. But we pattern designers are setting a schedule for ourselves. We usually have kind of planned out a whole list of designs that we want to publish in a year. And if our testing is not getting done on time, then that's going to push other things back, tech editing and when we're taking the photos and things like that. So do your very best to try to work to deadline. When you know that you can't hit a deadline, make sure that you let the designer know as soon as you know, and still try to give them as much feedback as possible, even if you have not been able to finish your project. So again, we know stuff comes up, but if we see a tester that keeps signing up for test nets and keep missing a deadline, then they're probably not going to get a lot more opportunities when we have other testers that are able to meet deadlines a little bit more consistently. Number 3, yes, you have to swatch, and yes, you need to get gauge. So part of the reason you're testing is to make sure that the instructions are correct in the pattern. If you are working at a different gauge, then you're not really testing those instructions, because your thing is going to come out a different size than it's supposed to, and that is not helping the designer evaluate the pattern, see if any changes need to be made, ensure that everybody's going to get a thing that is the right size. So if the designer is giving you a gauge, you should be working your best to hit that gauge. Minor discrepancies, sure. A lot of people will not get row gauge, but will get stitch gauge, things like that. Maybe you are off by a half stitch over 4 inches. That's sort of to be expected. If you're off a full stitch per inch, that's a dramatic change. And whatever you're knitting is going to be very different than what the designer has, not only in size, but in the drape of the fabric, the fit of the garment. So unless the designer has specifically said that you can change your gauge, or that gauge isn't important, they might say that for a shawl, it's really important that you get gauge. And in order to make sure that you get gauge, you really do need to swatch. One of the reasons that gauge can be important, even in something like a shawl, is that it's going to impact the yardage or meterage, and designers really want to include an accurate yardage estimate, especially for a garment, but even for a shawl, especially if you've got a shawl that has multiple colors, and you really need to kind of be specific about how much you need of each color. Now, if what you're saying is 1 skein of each yarn, fine. But if the designer wants to be more precise, then they really need you to work to gauge, or to very, very close to gauge, so that the information you're providing is accurate, and they can take all of the information they get from all the testers and come up with a good yardage or meterage range for the pattern. So please swatch, work to gauge, so that you're actually testing what the designer has written and you're able to give them sort of accurate feedback. Number 4, take really great photos. I know this is not something everybody can do for a number of reasons, but you really want to take the best photos that you can. That doesn't necessarily mean you're going to do a whole fancy photo shoot. But as I said, one of the reasons that designers want to test their patterns is not just to test the content of the pattern, but to get different versions of the pattern out there for potential customers to see. And if your photos are dark and grainy and whatever it is kind of crumpled up on the floor, that's not really showing other people truly whatever it is looks like. So take the best photos that you are able to. You don't have to have a fancy camera. You can use your phone camera, but make sure it's daylight. Make sure that it's if it's a shawl, you have room to spread it out, or you are able to model it nicely, or maybe you have dress form to put it on, and that you don't have like lots of other kind of clutter around in the background. And so this is not something that is absolutely essential, but if you want to keep getting test knitting opportunities, then taking really good quality photos is a way to ensure that that keeps happening, because designers really want photos that are showing off their work. So again, not essential. Like sometimes I understand you're just taking a picture to show the designer that it's done, which is appreciated, that, hey, I met the deadline and here's my photo and I got it done. But in terms of the quality of the photos, that's not why we want photos, to prove that you finished it. So we want photos that are going to help show off whatever it is. So take the best quality photos that you are personally able to. And then number 5, give accurate and honest feedback to the designer. So the feedback time for testing. A lot of designers may have a form that they've asked you to fill out, or maybe they just asked you to send them an email, whatever the case may be. This is not the time to be telling the designer how much you love them and you love their work. We love to hear that. That's fantastic. But in terms of feedback for testing, it's not that helpful. So we are always going to welcome, I guess I can't speak for every designer, but if you just want to send a designer an email telling her how much you love her work, excellent, do that. But for test knitting itself, this is not the time for that, because we really need honest feedback to make sure the pattern is the best that it can be. So if you found a problem with the pattern, if something wasn't clear, or you think something could be explained better, or something was inaccurate, this is the time to be very honest about those things. This is not the time where we're going to feel insulted because of something you said. We really need your honest opinion about the pattern. Now, if you don't like whatever it is, that's fine. Nobody's going to like everything. Maybe you just don't like how your thing turned out, and that's great. You're entitled to have that feeling, but what we want is feedback about the pattern itself. If there were problems with any of the instructions, and it's not necessarily errors, it's this part wasn't clear, or I think that the fabric is too thin knit at this gauge, things like that. That's going to help us make better patterns. I think this is ugly is not, or I think this is beautiful, while again, we really appreciate that, also not really going to help us improve our patterns. So you really want to be honest during the feedback process, and you also want to be accurate. So this is again why we really need to swatch and check gauge, so that all of the feedback you're giving is accurate for the pattern. If you're working at a different gauge, a lot of your feedback about sizing, about the drape of the fabric and things like that is not really going to be accurate, because it doesn't reflect the pattern itself. It reflects something different, which is your gauge working the pattern. The other thing is, again, affected by swatch and gauge, we really need accurate information about the final dimensions of whatever it is, and about how much yarn you used. 5 skeins is not, unless you used absolutely every bit of that skein, that's not really helping us kind of narrow down and get to how much yarn we need to be recommending to people. So if you are able to get a digital scale, you can get one for like 10, 15 bucks on Amazon, so you can actually weigh your yarn to get accurate yardage or meterage. Make sure that you wash and block whatever it is, and then you take accurate measurements of whatever the finished, if the bust circumference is supposed to be 40 inches and it comes out 36 inches, we need to know that. So, kind of eyeballing it is not going to be helpful. So be really precise and accurate in your final measurements and what gauge you had and how much yarn you used. That is really what is going to help pattern designers produce better and better quality patterns. So again, those are my 5 tips for being a really great test knitter so that you can help designers make better patterns, and so that your test knitting skills are going to keep being in demand, and they may lead, as I said, to other things like sample knitting, which is paid work, or other opportunities to help designers out in various ways. Designers may ask to use your photos, on the pattern page. They, if they're really happy with the work you've done, they've seen it in your test knitting, then if you're interested in sample knitting, they have a better idea of, the quality of the work that you're going to produce. And who knows what other opportunities may come up in the future. So test knitting is, it's a labor of love sometimes, but it's a really great way to support independent pattern designers. And if it is something you are interested in, that is my best advice for making sure you are the best test knitter that you can be.